Resentment is a cage without bars, invisible to the eyes, but with the key rusting every day in the palm of your hand, waiting for you to dare let go of pride, fear, and the habit of nursing your pain. In this audiobook, we are not going to sugarcoat forgiveness or dress it up as a virtue. Here, it's not about making peace with anyone but yourself. We are going to break the cycle of resentment and help you finally release what should no longer have power over you. Chapter 1. The Invisible Weight. There are burdens you don't choose to carry, yet you end up shouldering them anyway. They don't appear all at once. It's not as if one morning you wake up and say, "From now on, I will drag this pain for the rest of my life." No. They start as a slight unease, something you can't quite place. But it's there. It creeps into conversations, into the way you respond, into that gesture you make when someone utters certain words. It slips into your silences. And over time, it becomes part of you, even though it was never yours to begin with. Some people live their whole lives carrying wounds they can't even clearly remember. Not because they weren't real, but because the brain learned to hide them, to minimize them, to file them away in some corner, so daily life is bearable. But just because you don't see them doesn't mean they're not at work. They are. They show up in how you relate to others, how you distrust, how you shield yourself, even when no one is attacking. It's the invisible weight of unresolved harm. You don't see it, but it shapes you. It exhausts you. And the most insidious part of this weight is that, at some point, you mistake it for yourself. You believe that distrust is your character, that constant fear is simply who you are, that the distance you keep from others is prudence, when in fact it is the reflection of a poorly healed wound. You get used to carrying what hurts you and end up calling it personality. You integrate it into your identity without noticing. And of course, if you perceive it as part of you, how on earth will you consider letting it go? But you weren't born with that burden. It is not part of you by nature. There was a moment, maybe years ago, maybe in your childhood, when someone failed you, when someone said what they shouldn't have, or stayed silent when you needed them most, when someone denied you affection, presence, or care, and you, who didn't yet know how to fully defend yourself, did what any human does to avoid breaking. You adapted. You built a way to move forward, to prevent that pain from happening again. And that defense worked at the time. It protected you. But it wasn't meant to last a lifetime. The problem is that what starts as a survival strategy eventually becomes a wall. And that wall not only keeps new pain out, it also keeps you in, keeps you from living without fear, without that constant tension, from trusting, opening up, relating from a clean place. Yes, you have survived, but you did so by shutting down, by disconnecting. And that, though it may feel like strength, is actually a form of imprisonment. Some go years without identifying that weight. They only notice they're tired, irritable, unable to enjoy life, and they blame it on external factors: work, routine, lack of time. But when they truly stop and listen to themselves without distractions, they discover that the burden doesn't come from outside. It comes from within, from a part of themselves that never allowed itself to heal. And note, healing is not forgetting. It is not minimizing what happened. It is not pretending everything was fine. On the contrary, healing means acknowledging, naming, admitting that something hurt you more than you wanted to accept. And there, in that recognition, the process of liberation begins. Because when you name what weighs on you, you stop hiding it. And when you stop hiding it, you can begin to release it. The hard part, the truly hard part, is granting yourself permission to do so. Because some feel that if they let go of the pain, they are forgiving the unforgivable. That if they stop suffering for what happened, it is as if they are saying it wasn't that serious. But that isn't true. You don't need to keep suffering for what you experienced to validate it. Your pain has meaning on its own. You don't have to justify it with eternal misery. The invisible weight we speak of is not made up only of memories. It is also made of guilt, broken expectations, unsaid conversations, explanations that never came. It is made of everything you would have liked to happen but never did. And also of everything that happened and you have yet to digest. That is why it is so hard to identify. Because it is not a single thing. It is a web of emotions, intertwined, and together they bind you to the past. And there comes a point when, if you do nothing, that becomes your normal state. You learn to function with pain on your back, like someone lugging a heavy backpack who never even thinks to put it down. You adapt to the weight. You integrate it into your day-to-day. But that is not living. It is surviving. And surviving forever wears you down. Takes its toll, even if it is not obvious at first glance. The key is daring to look inward with honesty. Not to wallow in the hurt, but to understand where the fatigue comes from. That aimless anger, that sadness that shows up unannounced. And once you understand it, you can decide. You can choose to stop carrying what is no longer yours. You can begin to let go. Letting go is not a magic gesture. It does not happen overnight. It is a process. A journey that starts when you decide that your well-being matters more than resentment. When you understand that you don't need to keep punishing yourself for what others did. That you no longer have to protect yourself from a danger that has already passed. That you can stop looking back as if your life still lies there. Forgiveness in this context is not for the one who hurt you. It is for you, so you can start walking unburdened, so you can breathe without that constant pressure on your chest, so you can discover that beneath all that weight, there is a version of you that has been waiting for years to emerge. And no, it is not easy. Nobody said it would be. But if you keep carrying what is not yours, you will end up dropping what is. Your energy, your relationships, your peace. So even if it costs you, begin to examine what you carry. Ask yourself if you still need it, if it adds anything, if it truly belongs to you. And if it does not, if it has served its purpose, set it down. You don't have to be strong all the time. You don't have to fix everything today. You only need to become aware that this weight exists, that you have carried it too long, that it no longer serves you, and that you have the right to walk lighter. Because life shouldn't be a constant struggle. It should be a space where you can breathe, move, and advance. And for that, the first step is to let go. Not for others, for you. Chapter 2. What is unnamed repeats. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't what happened, but what was never said aloud. There are silences that don't protect, but poison, that don't soothe, but anesthetize. And when you grow up accustomed to hiding your pain, you end up thinking that is maturity, that swallowing without a word is part of life. But it is not. That is fear. Fear of unearthing what was meant to stay buried. Fear of confronting a part of yourself you don't know how to handle. Fear of not being understood, of not being believed, of seeming weak. And in that fear, the pain hides, but it does not disappear. It just hides better. From childhood, we're taught there are things better left unsaid. That if something stings, you should look the other way. Carry on. Pretend nothing happened. That's it. Don't overthink it. Better not to dredge up the past. It's not worth it. And again, we push emotions inward that should come out, that deserve a name, a space, a body. But we don't let them out. We don't process them. We don't face them. We keep them silent, floating in some corner of the mind, unresolved, unexamined, as if over time they would lose importance. But what happens is not that they vanish. What happens is they repeat. Not always with the same people or in the same situations, but with the same root. What is unnamed becomes a pattern. It reappears in other faces, other contexts, but the core is the same. You find yourself trapped in dynamics you lived before, reacting disproportionately to things that appear insignificant, and you don't understand why. You tell yourself you shouldn't be so affected, that you're exaggerating, that you're the problem, but you're not. What is happening is you carry within you a story left unfinished, an entrenched emotion that has yet to find release. The body senses it before the mind. You feel a pressure in your chest you cannot explain. You startle easily. You're on the defensive for no apparent reason. Your stomach tightens when someone mentions certain topics. It's not coincidence. These are signals. Your system telling you something remains unresolved, misunderstood, unnamed. And if you don't bring it into the light, if you don't give yourself permission to examine it, you will continue to react as if you are living it all over again. Because in a way you are. Every time you silence it, you feed it. Every time you hide it, you reinforce it. It is not about broadcasting your wounds to everyone. You don't need to make public everything you've experienced. But you do need, at least for yourself, to name what hurt you. To recognize it. To stop minimizing it. To stop justifying it. Because often, besides silencing our pain, we gloss over it. We dress it up as experience. We reduce it to an anecdote. We downgrade it to, it wasn't that bad. And in that attempt to appear unbreakable, we become accomplices to our own hurt. If forgiveness is to be truly liberating, it cannot be built on forced silence. You cannot forgive what you haven't fully acknowledged. Because as long as you keep downplaying it, as long as you avert your gaze, you cannot heal. Healing begins when you face what is trapped inside. When you sit with yourself and stop pretending everything is fine. When you dare to look back without fear, not to live in the past, but to understand how that past still shapes your present. And understanding is not the same as justifying. Comprehending what happened does not mean accepting it, much less allowing it to recur. But it does mean giving it a real place. Because while the pain floats in that limbo of the unspoken, it acts like a ghost, invisible but present, silent but decisive. And emotional ghosts don't leave on their own. They remain until you decide to see them, confront them, and finally bid them farewell. Often, when someone begins to speak their story, they realize they have spent years hiding things they never thought mattered that much. Because they normalized them. Because they integrated them as part of life. Because they believed they were inevitable. But the mere act of putting them into words changes something. Things once named lose that corrosive power. They become visible. And what is visible, however uncomfortable, can be worked on. What is buried, however, festers. It becomes shadow, and shadows that are never illuminated repeat. At its core, naming what hurt is an act of respect toward yourself. It is saying, this happened, this affected me, this has had consequences in my life. It is not victimhood, it is honesty. And without that honesty, forgiveness becomes a facade. You may say you've let go, repeat it as many times as you like. But if you haven't done the inner work of acknowledging the pain, if you haven't given it space to be heard, you have released nothing. You have only buried it deeper. The good news is it is never too late to start speaking. It is never too late to sit with yourself and review the parts of your story that still sting. You don't need to resolve everything at once, but you do need to begin. You need to open that door that has been closed for years, not to wallow in pain, but to free it, to stop carrying what is no longer yours. Because as long as you keep it silent, it will continue acting beneath the surface, in your decisions, in your relationships, in the way you see yourself. And yes, at first it hurts. Putting words to certain wounds can stir more than you expected. But that pain is part of the process. You are not getting worse. You are confronting. You are doing exactly what you never did, looking directly at it, naming it, deciding, from awareness, that you no longer want to repeat that story over and over. We are not condemned to live trapped in what was unresolved, but to get out, you first must admit you are inside. And that, simple as it may sound, demands courage, because it means acknowledging there are parts of you have not dared to look at, emotions you have denied, conversations you never had. But at the same time, it gives you power, the power to change, to heal, to stop repeating what you no longer wish to live. What is unnamed repeats, but what is recognized transforms. Chapter 3. It wasn't your fault, but it is your responsibility. There are moments in life when things simply happen to you. People arrive and break you without explanation. Situations crush you that you never sought. Words lodge themselves where they hurt most, even when they weren't meant to wound. And there you are, having done nothing to deserve it, having provoked nothing, having had no control. You were just. You simply were. And even so, you suffered the consequences. And that is legitimate. It is real. There are things that happened to you that were never your fault, and never will be. You can replay the events over and over, try to make sense of them. Ask yourself if you could have prevented them. But there comes a point when you need to understand that, no matter how much you turn it over, there was no choice on your part. What you lived through was imposed. It was not a consequence of your decisions. It was not a reflection of your worth. It was something external that fell upon you and broke you, and you didn't need to do anything differently because it wasn't in your hands. However, what is in your hands is what you do today with that wound. Because although you are not responsible for what was done to you, you are responsible for what you do now with that wound. And that is a hard truth to swallow, because it hurts, because it seems unfair. One might think, how can I be expected to carry the work of healing something I didn't cause? Why should I be the one to repair the damage when someone else inflicted it? And I understand. I know. But life doesn't operate on automatic justice. And if you wait for the one who hurt you to come and fix what they broke, you will likely wait forever. Forgiveness, understood as a tool for liberation, does not begin when the other acknowledges their guilt, nor when the world compensates you. It begins when you decide to stop living at the mercy of a wound you didn't choose but that still governs you. And that is not surrender. It is a form of power. Because as long as you wait for the change to come from outside, you remain immobile. You remain conditioned. You react instead of decide. But when you take responsibility for your process, however angry or unfair it seems, you regain the reins. And with them, you reclaim your life. It is not about forgiving to absolve the other. It is not about justifying their behavior or pretending nothing happened. It is about you, about what you want to build from now on. Because as long as you keep feeding resentment, no matter how justified, you keep revolving around that person or event. And that means they still hold power over you, even if they are no longer present, even if you don't recall them every day. Unresolved pain finds 1,000 ways to stay, sometimes in the body, sometimes in your relationships, often in your thought patterns. Being responsible is not assuming fault. It is understanding that your well-being depends on what you decide to do today. Not tomorrow, not when others change, not when someone apologizes. Today. And that is not an obligation. It is an opportunity. You can continue waiting for the world to make you whole, or you can start rebuilding from where you are. It is not fair, I know, but it is real. Some people have passed through your life and left you with a shattered heart. People who should have cared for you and hurt you, who took advantage of your trust, or who vanished when you needed them most. And no, you didn't cause it. You didn't seek it. You didn't deserve it. But if today you walk around as if you still must protect yourself from that same danger, if you relate to others with distrust or fear, then the wound continues to mark your path. And that no longer depends on the one who caused it. It now depends on you. Taking responsibility does not invalidate what you suffered. It does the opposite. It treats it so seriously that you decide not to let it define every step you take. Enough is enough. You've carried enough. It's time to do something different. Not to forget, but to heal. Not to minimize, but to close. And yes, closing requires facing everything you have been avoiding. That old pain that seems asleep but still affects you without you realizing it. The process is not immediate. There is no straight line to follow. But it begins with an inner decision. Stop blaming what is outside for what you can already begin to change. Because there are people who have spent half a lifetime pointing fingers at others. Rightly, with arguments, with proof. But they remain trapped. They stay within the same story, not because they lack reasons, but because they haven't taken the step of stopping living within that narrative. And when you finally do, when you decide you want a life not designed around your wounds, the hard work begins. Because now you are the one who has to construct a new path. A path without excuses, without justifications, without the shelter of pain. You have to relearn to trust, to give yourself, to look ahead without fear. And that is hard, because it is much easier to say, "It wasn't my fault," than to take charge of what is within your grasp. But it is also far more transformative. That is where true liberation begins. Because there is no greater trap than living while waiting for someone else to change so you can be at peace. No greater loss than giving the past control of your present. You don't have to do it all at once, nor do you have to forgive before you feel it. But you can start making decisions from a different place, one where you are no longer a hostage to what happened. Your story has scars, yes. Some will stay with you always. But they don't have to be the center of your life. They don't have to define who you are, what you're worth, what you can give or receive. You have the right to stop surviving. To start living with awareness, intention, and the certainty that forgiveness born of responsibility is not a concession. It is a conquest. And no one will do it for you. Because no one else has access to what you feel, to what you think, to the things you tell yourself every day. Only you can decide whether you continue waiting for the past to change, or whether you finally allow yourself to move forward without dragging it all along. It wasn't your fault. But if today you remain stuck there, if you continue letting it condition your steps, then it is your responsibility to choose another path. And it is about time.
Chapter 4. Pride as Refuge.
Pride is one of those things that, when it protects you, seems like strength, but when it dominates, imprisons you, it masquerades as courage, dignity, character. But in reality, many times, it is merely a mechanism you learned when you didn't know how to truly defend yourself. It is a barrier, an automatic response, a shield you forged at a moment when you needed to feel that no one could harm you again. And the curious thing is, it works. For a while, it works. Because it holds you up. It gives you something to cling to when everything else falters. But it was not made to remain. Because living through pride keeps you safe, yes, but it also keeps you distant. Distant from others. Distant from yourself. Distant from any possibility of healing, letting go, rebuilding something real. Pride feeds on silence, distance, on the need to prove you are unaffected, that you can handle everything, that you don't need anyone. And the more you feed it, the stronger it seems. But the more isolated you become. It is easy to hide pain behind pride, because pride doesn't hurt. Pain does. Pride makes you feel large. Pain forces you to admit something touched you, something overwhelmed you, that you couldn't handle it as you expected. And that, for many, is too much. So it is simpler to adopt that cold gesture, that firm posture, that clipped tone, and say, "I've moved on," even though inside you still carry a wound that won't heal because you never gave it the time and space it needed. And so time passes. You say you've forgotten, but whenever you see that person or someone mentions what happened, you feel that same pang in your chest. And you don't share it. You don't speak of it. Not because you're unaffected, but because you've spent so long pretending nothing's wrong that you no longer know how to acknowledge it, how to recognize that it still hurts, that it is still unresolved. And that is where pride ceases to be defense and becomes prison. Because you no longer know how to step out of the role you created for yourself. You have been strong for so long that no one expects anything else from you, not even you. So you swallow, you stay silent, and you carry on as if it were normal, as if silence were victory, as if not expressing what you feel made you more dignified, more adult, more stable. But inside something rots, because there are emotions you cannot repress forever without them bursting out somewhere. And pride, despite appearances, is a form of suffering. It is living from rigidity, from control, from the constant need to prove you don't need anyone, that nothing affects you, that you overcame it all. But it isn't true. Sometimes you are broken and you don't admit it. Sometimes you are wounded and you deny it. And in that self-deception you lose yourself, bit by bit, without even realizing. Pride itself is not the enemy. The problem is when you mistake it for identity. When you become someone who won't allow a crack, a doubt, a need. When you refuse to apologize, even though you know you were wrong. When you cannot forgive, even though you know you remain bound to what happened. Because sometimes forgiveness is not a matter of reasons, but ego. And that is where pride strikes. It whispers that if you forgive, you lose. That if you open up, you degrade yourself. That if you soften, you become vulnerable. And you believe it. Because once it saved you. But now it prevents you from moving forward. Forgiving from pride is impossible. Because pride needs to be right, to stand above, to have a logic confirming its position. But forgiveness demands lowering your guard. It demands looking inward. It demands admitting there are things the mind cannot solve. That some decisions can only be made by the heart. And that is where many get stuck, because to forgive you must release pride. And letting go of pride is sometimes more painful than holding on to resentment. But there is no other way out. Because as long as you cling to the idea that no one can touch you, that no one deserves a second chance, that you stand above it all, you will keep repeating the same patterns. You will become inaccessible, someone hard to love. Not because you lack value, but because the armor you wear stops anyone from seeing you truly. And when no one sees you, no one reaches you. And when no one reaches you, you end up thinking the problem is the world. But it is not the world. It is you. You protecting yourself so fiercely that you won't let anyone come close. You telling yourself over and over you need no help, that you can handle everything, that it's all in the past. But if it were true, you wouldn't be so tense. It wouldn't hurt so much. You wouldn't still drag that shadow. Forgiveness needs a space where pride does not have the final word. Because forgiveness is not a display of weakness. It is a display of presence. It is saying, yes, it hurt me. Yes, it still affects me. But I no longer want to live through that hurt. I no longer want to be trapped in this posture that distances me from everything. I no longer want my life defined by what hurt me and by the wall I built to keep it from happening again. And of course, it's scary. Letting go of pride is exposing yourself. It is accepting that you might not have all the answers, that you may have been wrong too, that there may have been something you could have done differently. But at the same time, letting go of pride is reclaiming your humanity. It is looking at yourself honestly again. It is ceasing to act as if you must prove something all the time, because you don't have to prove anything anymore. What happened, happened. And if it hurts, that is valid. If it marked a before and after, that matters too. But you cannot continue hiding behind that attitude as if it were your ultimate shield. Because what protects you today may isolate you tomorrow. And isolation does not heal. It only prolongs the pain. It only entangles it further. If you want to move forward, if you want to truly forgive, you will have to face that part of you that still needs to feel superior in order not to feel vulnerable. You will have to make room for error, for emotion, for contradiction. You will have to give up the perfect self-image pride works so hard to build. And that, though painful, is the bravest thing you can do. Because in the end, it is not about winning or being right. It is about being at peace. And you will not find that peace in pride. You will find it when you allow yourself to be who you are, with everything that entails, without hiding behind anything. Chapter 5. Forgiveness does not imply reconciliation. One of the most common and dangerous mistakes is confusing forgiveness with the obligation to reopen the door to the one who slammed it shut with violence. Believing that forgiving means reconciling has caused many people to remain trapped in toxic relationships, in draining dynamics, in connections where harm repeats itself under the guise of second chances. We have been taught to think that forgiveness erases everything, that it means acting as if nothing happened, that it entails restoring contact, rebuilding the bond, extending the hand. But that is not forgiveness. That is confusion, and often fear of cutting off what can no longer stand. Forgiveness begins when you stop carrying the poison of resentment, when you decide that wound will no longer define you. But that does not mean you must return to the place where the harm originated. It does not mean you must look kindly on the one who hurt you. It does not mean you have to rebuild what was broken. Because some people do not deserve to return to your life, even if you no longer hold a grudge. There are doors that must remain closed, not out of hatred, but out of mental health, dignity, and self-protection. One thing is freeing your heart from the burden you carry. Quite another is allowing those who hurt you to occupy space they no longer deserve. Some people simply have no place in your present, not because you cannot forgive them, but because you have grown, understood, and healed enough not to want to repeat that story. And that too is forgiveness. Forgiving from a distance, in silence, through final separation. And that does not make you less compassionate. It makes you more conscious. True forgiveness arises when you understand you don't need vengeance, punishment, or perfect restitution. You only need peace. And that peace sometimes arrives only when you give up the need for the other to change, to understand, to apologize. Peace does not depend on the other doing what is right. It depends on you letting go of the need that they do so. And in that gesture, you also choose how you want your life to be from now on, what kinds of people you let near, what stories you choose to nourish. There are bonds that taught you to survive through fear, distrust, and the need to justify what was never fair. And when you finally allow yourself to see them clearly, you forgive. Not because you forget, but because you stop waiting for something from them. You stop demanding they be different. You stop lingering where you are unseen, uncared for, unheard. And by walking away, drawing the line with no hatred but with firm resolve, you complete the closure of that wound. That too is forgiveness, both toward the other and toward yourself. Because there is a form of forgiveness that goes unspoken, undelivered as a gift, unannounced. It is practiced within, a silent act in which you decide you no longer wish to be trapped by what happened, yet you will not make room for those who fail to care for you. Many mistake this for rancor. They tell you you should give another chance, that time has passed, that everyone errs. But it is not vengeance. It is boundaries. Because forgiveness does not erase the need to protect yourself. It does not cancel the lessons learned. It does not undo the path you took to escape that place. And there are people who, even if they change, apologize, or swear they see everything differently, should not return. Because some wounds could not survive another attempt. Because some processes were closed calmly but with clarity that doesn't deserve to be undermined. Forgiveness is not blind trust. It is not giving endless second, third, or fourth chances. It is not justifying the unjustifiable. It is making peace with yourself, and from there, deciding which relationships support your well-being and which push you away from it. Forgiveness doesn't bind you to anything. It frees you without shackling you. It lightens you without confusing you. And sometimes the greatest act of self-love is recognizing that a relationship, however significant, is no longer safe, is no longer healthy, is no longer compatible with who you are today. If you return out of fear of seeming cold, of appearing uncaring, of being judged, then you are not forgiving. You are surrendering. You are betraying yourself. You are mistaking compassion for self-abandonment. Some people remain in your life simply because you lacked the courage to close the door entirely, because you convinced yourself you had to be noble, that you had no right to pass judgment. But it is not about judgment. It is about decisions, and no one else can make them for you. Forgiveness does not demand that you continue sharing your life with those who never knew how to cherish it. It demands that you free yourself from the emotional burden, nothing more, nothing less. When you finally understand this, everything changes. You no longer need the other to apologize. You no longer depend on reconciliation. You simply know you did what you had to do. Named the harm, released the weight, set the boundary. And from there, you walk on. Forgiveness is not looking back. It is an inflection point. The moment you decide to live without resentment, but also without pretense. And for many, that is the hardest reconciliation of all, the one with yourself. Chapter 6. Ego and its need to be right. There is a part of you that is always on guard. No matter the situation or the moment, that part is ready to correct, to defend, to prove that you are right. It is a voice that never rests, that analyzes every word, every gesture, every silence, and interprets it as an attack or a threat. It is the ego. And though many see it as a flaw in others, the truth is we all have it. All of us at some point have preferred being right over being at peace. All of us have argued more out of pride than conviction. All of us have wanted to win, even when we didn't know exactly why. The ego is not evil. It is not empty arrogance. It is a construct. It is formed from what you were told was valuable, from what you learned to hide, from what you believed made you strong. It is that image you've created of yourself, which you strive to uphold even when it no longer makes sense. And therein lies the problem. The constant need to protect that image, even if it means shutting down, even if it hardens you, even if it leads you to lie to yourself. When the ego takes control, you do not listen to understand. You listen to reply. You do not argue to find a solution. You argue to show that you see something the other doesn't. You do not speak from the wound, but from the armor. And that armor keeps you firm, but also distances you. It distances you from others, and above all, from yourself. Because the more you insist on being right, the more you disconnect from what you truly feel. Often, behind that need to be right lies fear. Fear of being questioned. Fear of appearing weak. Fear that yielding will be taken as submission. So you adopt that inflexible stance, cling to your arguments as if they were a lifeline, and fight to assert yourself, even when the conversation no longer makes sense. And you do it even with the ones you love most, even in situations where there is nothing to gain. Because deep down, you are not defending an idea. You are defending yourself. The ego convinces you that if you step back, you lose. That if you admit you were wrong, you become exposed. That if you give in, you allow yourself to be trampled. But the truth is, the only thing you lose when you let go of that fight is tension. And the only thing that breaks is the rigidity you've used to hold on to something you no longer need. It is not about yielding on everything. It is not about renouncing your ideas or swallowing what hurts. It is about asking yourself what exactly you are defending. Whether you are defending a truth or a wound. Whether you are acting from clarity or from fear. Whether you need to be right or you need recognition, to be seen, to be valued. Because often, that insistence on being right is nothing more than a hidden plea for love. And the problem is, no one can give it to you if you yourself are closed off to receive it. Some arguments could have been avoided with a single phrase. Perhaps I went too far, or with a gesture, or with a conscious silence. But the ego won't allow it. The ego demands a final word, a justification, proof that you were correct. And so tensions stretch out, conflicts drag on, bridges break. Not because there is no affection, but because there is a stronger need to protect the identity you've built. And it is legitimate. We all want to feel in control, that our thoughts matter, that our perspective counts. But there comes a time when you must ask whether what you are defending truly represents you, or if it simply serves to avoid feeling vulnerable. Because forgiveness, when it arrives, needs no detailed explanation. It requires no perfect fit. It does not demand being right. Forgiveness is given when you stop fighting what happened and choose to prioritize your well-being above your pride. And that is not always easy to achieve. Sometimes the hardest part is not forgiving the other, but letting go of needing them to admit you were right. Because deep down, that is one of the ego's greatest attachments, external validation. Needing the other to say you were right, as if that would heal the wound. But the wound is not healed by recognition. It is healed when you decide you no longer need that phrase to move on. When you stop depending on someone else's reaction to feel justified. And that is where freedom begins. When you allow yourself not to answer every provocation. When you choose silence not out of weakness, but for peace. When you recognize that being right does not guarantee happiness, connection, or serenity. That you can know you were correct and still let it go. Not because it doesn't matter, but because you no longer wish to feed something that no longer serves you. When ego dominates, every conflict becomes a battle. And living in a state of war leaves no room for forgiveness, because everything turns into a power struggle. But forgiveness requires humility, not submissive humility, but genuine humility. The kind that acknowledges there are things you can let go, even if you have reasons to keep them. The kind that understands not everything needs to be resolved in your favor. The kind that allows space for mistakes, yours and others, without seeing them as threats. Learning to release the need to be right is one of the toughest paths to healing, because it is not just changing a behavior, it is confronting that part of yourself that needs to feel superior to avoid feeling insecure. And it is not easy, but it is necessary, because as long as ego leads, you will remain trapped in a constant fight, even if it doesn't appear so. Even if you believe you are merely being consistent or firm. Forgiveness, on the other hand, does not need to win. It does not need to assert itself. It only needs space. And that space appears when you stop defending, when you no longer need to convince anyone, when your well-being no longer depends on being right, but on feeling at peace with what you choose to leave behind. Letting go of ego is not surrender. It is choosing which battles deserve your energy. It is allowing yourself to live without the stress of constantly proving you are right. And that choice, though uncomfortable, is the first step toward a freer life. Chapter 7. Remembering is not reliving. Remembering is not going back to the past. It is not reopening the wound or getting trapped in the same place where you suffered. Remembering is looking squarely at what happened, without denying it touched you, without disguising the pain, without hiding what still, in some way, resonates within you. But remembering, when done mindfully, does not have to paralyze you. It does not have to drag you back to that dark place where you didn't know how to escape. Remembering, in fact, can be an act of power, of clarity, of transformation, if you know from where you do it. The problem is that we often learn to link memory with pain, to believe that if we speak of what happened, if we bring it into the present, we will inevitably suffer it as if for the first time. As if recalling what we lived would be the same as living it again. And so we forbid ourselves to remember. We tell ourselves it's better to leave it behind, that there is no point stirring up what has already occurred. But what we avoid does not disappear. It only accumulates and eventually emerges in ways we don't always understand. In mood swings, in insecurities, in blocks we can't trace back. What you do not allow yourself to remember clearly, you end up repeating unconsciously. Not because you are weak, nor because you want to remain stuck, but because parts of you have yet to close that chapter. And to close it, you need to look at it, not with fear, not from guilt, but with a clear gaze from a place where you can support yourself while observing what happened. Without dramatizing or exaggerating, but neither minimizing. Because what hurt, hurt. What left a mark, left a mark. And it is not about denying it, but about putting it in its place. Remembering is situating. It is organizing. It is saying, this is how it was. This is how it affected me. This no longer needs to repeat. And for that, you must allow yourself to enter the memory without getting stuck inside it, without reliving it as if you had made no progress, without succumbing to the emotional loop that makes you think you remain at the same point. Because you are not at the same point. You are now someone else. You have grown. You have understood things you couldn't see then. And although part of you remains vulnerable, you have also developed tools you didn't know before. It is not about reopening what cost you to close. It is about seeing it with new eyes, from another vantage point, from a present in which you can recognize that what you experienced hurt, yes, but it does not define you. That what happened marked you, but does not determine you. There is a huge difference between having memory and living anchored in it, and that difference is marked by how you stand today, how you look, how you choose to let that chapter of your story relate to your life now. Because you are not what happened to you, you are what you do with it. You are how you choose to remember it, how you decide whether that memory will anchor you or propel you. Because some memories weigh you down, but others teach. They remind you how far you've come. They let you acknowledge that pain, though real, did not stop your progress. And in that moment, you no longer need to flee from the past. You can integrate it. Accept it as part of your journey without it condemning you. Forgiveness is not erasing. It is not pretending nothing happened. Forgiveness also involves remembering, but remembering without reliving. Without suffering each time you bring it to mind, without letting that memory have the power to unbalance you, to wound you, to paralyze you. When you truly forgive, memory changes form. It remains, but it no longer hurts the same. It no longer weighs the same. It no longer commands you. Some mistake forgiveness for oblivion, believing that if they continue remembering, they haven't healed. But that isn't true. Memory is inevitable. What changes is how you live with it. You can remember in peace. You can remember with serenity. You can even remember with gratitude, strange as it sounds, because sometimes what hurt most also showed you what needed changing. And realizing that is not justifying the harm. It is acknowledging your growth. It is valuing your path. And that is when memory stops being a threat. When you can look at it without fear. When you can speak of what happened without feeling shaken to your core. When you no longer need to justify or defend yourself or seek approval. Only to remember and let that memory occupy its rightful place, not as a bottomless pit, but as a page read, understood, and set aside. That is the key. Not letting it drag you under, not bringing you back to where you do not want to go. Because you are not the same as you were then. And though there may still be moments when the memory stings, when an image or phrase stirs you, that does not mean you have failed. It means you continue processing, that you are alive, that you are on the journey. And that, believe it or not, is part of forgiveness. You do not need to pretend it didn't happen. You don't need to block the memory to move on. What you need is to learn to face it without fear, without succumbing to drama, without letting it drag you down. And that is not achieved by denying what you felt. It is achieved by acknowledging it, giving it space, shaping it, and then choosing what place it holds in your life today. Remembering is not reliving. You relive only when you haven't healed, when what you recall remains open. But when you close it, when you cleanse it, when you organize it, you can look without falling. You can speak without breaking. You can return to certain places without being overwhelmed by anguish. Because the memory itself is not dangerous. What is dangerous is not having worked through it. What is dangerous is dragging it without understanding it. And that is why this process isn't about erasing. It is about redefining. About ceasing to see the past as a threat and beginning to see it as part of a journey you have traversed. And yes, perhaps you didn't do everything right. Perhaps for a while you lived from pain, fear, anger. But that was part of the process. And now you are here, with more awareness, more tools, greater capacity to see yourself truly. Memory is not the enemy. It is a guide, a mirror, a starting point, and you choose how to use it. You can remain stuck in what was, or you can transform it into a foundation for what is to come. Because in the end, what makes the difference is not whether you remember, but how you relate to that memory, what you do with it, and above all, from where you choose to live today. Chapter 8. What you expected and never occurred. There are wounds that do not bleed, that leave no visible marks, that have no specific scene to point at. They are silent wounds, made of absences, moments that never happened, words you needed, but never came. Sometimes what was missing hurts more than what was present, more what you expected to happen than what truly did. Because when something doesn't occur, it cannot be closed. There is no clear ending, no explanation, only a void that floats, filling everything with unanswered questions. You expected a gesture, a call, an apology, an embrace that never came, a figure to protect you, someone to step toward you when you needed them most. And it didn't happen. There was no gesture, no word, no presence. And the silence became an inner echo repeating again and again. You weren't enough, even though it was untrue, even though it had nothing to do with you, even though the other's absence spoke more of their limits than of your worth. But it is not easy to understand when you are the one left waiting, when each time you opened the door with hope, you found the same emptiness. Then the body adapts to waiting. The mind accepts the idea that perhaps you do not deserve more, and the heart begins to close, little by little, as a defense mechanism. Because one disappointment hurts, but repeated disappointment leaves a mark, and not just any mark. One that sinks into your identity, makes you live defensively, turns you into someone who expects nothing so as not to break again. Many live with the pain of what never was, of what never existed, of what should have happened and did not. But since there is no scene, there is no claim. Since there is no direct attack, there is no concrete blame. And thus installs a kind of pain that no one validates, because nothing is visible and from the outside everything seems normal. But you know it was not, because you felt the cold, felt the void, felt the loneliness of waiting for someone who never knew how to occupy the place you expected of them. And that too can be forgiven, because not all that hurts comes from betrayal or mistake. Sometimes it comes from indifference, from lack, from emotional disconnection, and that too leaves cracks you carry for years without knowing why. Until one day you realize you are not angry at what happened, but at what did not happen. Not at what someone did, but at what someone never did when you needed it most. You expected your mother to defend you, your father to see you, your partner to truly listen, your friends to be there when you said you were unwell. You expected understanding, closeness, support, and found silence, distance, discomfort. And it wasn't asking too much. It was fair, it was basic, it was humane, but you didn't have it. And that leaves a mark hard to describe, because there's nothing tangible to cling to, only a hollow space. When you don't receive what you need, you learn to need less, to not ask, to not bother, to not expect. You do it as a way to protect yourself, to adapt to an unchangeable reality. But that adaptation, once a survival strategy, becomes years later a prison. A way of life where you always give more than you receive, where you excuse others' absences, where you place yourself second without realizing. And it all stems from what never occurred, from what you expected to receive and never did. And yes, that can be forgiven, but not by denying it, not by saying, surely they had reasons. True forgiveness begins when you validate your wound, when you tell yourself, no, it wasn't fair, it wasn't healthy, you did deserve more, not to stay trapped in victimhood, but to acknowledge the real impact of that void on your life, to stop acting as if nothing happened, to stop pretending you're fine when inside you know it marked you. Because only when you allow yourself to face that absence can you start to release it. Only when you accept you will not receive what you expected can you free yourself from longing. And at that moment, when you cease expecting the past to rewrite itself, when you stop needing that person to return and make it right, when you understand that debt will never be settled, you reclaim your power. Because you are no longer tethered to what never was. You are no longer living for a frustrated desire. You are here, now, deciding how to live from that awareness. Forgiving what never occurred is an act of emotional maturity, because there is no scene, no apology, nothing external. Only you with your pain, your story, and your ability to accept that some chapters were never written. And yet you can move forward, not by inertia, but by choice. Chapter 9. Forgiveness toward oneself. Sometimes it isn't what was done to you, nor what was said, nor even what didn't happen. It is what you did with yourself afterward, decisions you made knowing you were betraying yourself, times you stayed silent when you wanted to shout, moments you treated yourself as no one should be treated. When you looked in the mirror and saw nothing but failure, mistake, or disappointment. That is where the hardest kind of forgiveness begins, the one you cannot ask of anyone else, the one that only depends on you. You can spend half your life angry with yourself, though you never say it, though you hide it, though you seem okay on the outside. Because self-directed anger is not always visible. Sometimes it shows in how you speak to yourself inside, in how you demand of yourself, how you punish yourself, how you refuse rest or enjoyment. It shows in that guilt you drag around without knowing its origin, but it is there, constant, like background noise that taints everything. It is a guilt that does not shout or impose itself, but seeps into your way of living, into your decisions, into how you relate to others, into setting the bar increasingly higher, as if you must compensate for something, as if you are still paying a debt no one is demanding, but that you insist on settling. And that tires you. It exhausts you. Because no matter what you achieve, what you do, what you get, if there is no forgiveness for yourself, nothing is enough. At some point you made a mistake. You said something you didn't feel. You acted out of fear. You pushed away someone who mattered. Or you were the one who failed. And you kept it to yourself. You hid it. You tried to move on as if nothing happened. But inside, something did. Inside was a constant judgment, a harsh gaze, a silent punishment you accepted as part of yourself. And when that repeats long enough, you end up believing you deserve it, that you have no right to err, that what you did, what you failed to do, what you kept silent about, defines you forever. But it is not true. What you did in one moment does not summarize who you are. Nor does the worst thing you ever did make you a bad person. You were who you could be in that instant, operating with the tools you had, the awareness you carried, the emotions you didn't know how to channel. And yes, you could have done better. Of course. But that does not mean you deserve to live eternally punished for your mistakes. It means that if you have changed, if you see it, if it still hurts, then you are no longer that version of yourself, and continuing to judge yourself by it only keeps you stuck. Forgiving yourself is not erasing what happened or making excuses. It is seeing yourself clearly, admitting your errors, acknowledging the consequences, but also granting yourself the right to move on. To not stay trapped in that image that reflects only a moment, a mistake, a stage. Forgiving yourself is ceasing to drag yourself down inside, to sabotage your own attempts to move forward, to punish yourself in secret. It is looking at that part of you that still feels ashamed and telling it, I know, it hurts, but I will no longer treat myself as an enemy. There comes a point in life when you must make a conscious decision. Either you continue punishing yourself for your past mistakes, or you begin to care for yourself as someone who deserves to do things differently. Not because you are perfect, but precisely because you were not. Because now you see what you once could not. Because now you understand what you could not before. And that shift in perspective is what allows you to build something new. From honesty, from compassion, not from denial, not from guilt, not from endless demands. Self-forgiveness does not happen in an instant. It is a process, a practice, a daily decision. It is choosing, again and again, not to speak from the voice that blames you, but from the one that wants to see you grow. It is understanding you deserve to heal even if you have hurt, and to rebuild even after you broke something important. You are always in time, always have time to live without the backpack you have carried for so long. Often, the hardest step is recognizing you need to forgive yourself, because that means admitting that a part of you has been wounded, hurting, at war with yourself. And that acknowledgement is no small thing, because it demands you pause, listen to what you usually avoid, sit with your story without hiding, without smoothing over what happened, but also without using it as a chain. Because if you don't free yourself from that, you will keep repeating the same pattern, seeking outside for redemption that only comes from within. And when you begin speaking to yourself with compassion, you do not become soft or irresponsible. You become more human, more aware, more capable of holding your story without letting it crush you. You start making decisions not from fear, but from commitment to yourself. You set boundaries not from anger, but from respect. You begin to live from a place of integrity, and that transforms how you relate to everything. Because without forgiveness for yourself, there cannot be true forgiveness for others. You cannot give what you do not give yourself. You cannot look at another with understanding if you haven't learned to do so with yourself. And that is why this chapter is essential. Because often the final step of forgiveness is not outward, but inward. It is closing that silent war you carry within. It is stopping living as if you were a defective project, as if your worth depended on never erring again. You can do better from now on. You can repair what can be repaired. You can learn. But for that, you must first release the stone you hold in your hand, the one you use to strike yourself each time you remember something you did wrong, and look at that moment with new eyes, deeply, responsibly, but also compassionately, because you will err again. But that does not mean you must carry all your mistakes with you. It means you are in process, you are human, you are learning, and that alone is reason enough to start treating yourself with more respect. Chapter 10. Emotional Inheritances. Not everything you carry is yours. Not every idea you repeat came from you. Not every emotion that moves through you was born in your own experiences. There are stories that began long before you were born, yet somehow became etched into your way of being in the world. And you didn't realize, because nobody explained that emotions too are inherited. That we not only inherit eye color, hand shape, or body build, but also fears, beliefs, ways of loving, and ways of relating to pain. You grow up in an environment and, without noticing, absorb everything happening around you. You absorb how your parents spoke to each other, how they treated one another when angry, how they handled sadness, frustration, or rage. You absorb what was said, but even more so what was left unsaid. The silence when something hurt, the tension when someone left without explanation, the casual avoidance of certain conversations. And you do this from childhood, without filters, without the ability to analyze. You simply record it as what is normal. Over time, what you normalize becomes a pattern, automatic behavior, a habitual response. One day you see yourself acting just like them, even though you vowed you wouldn't. Repeating words you once hated to hear, assuming roles you never asked for but inherited because nobody else wanted to bear them. And you wonder why. Why you react this way. Why you repeat relationships that mirror those you witnessed. Why you struggle to let go of guilt, the need for control, the sense that you must take responsibility for everything. The answer is not always in what happened to you, but in what you were taught should happen, in how you learned to connect, in what was rewarded, punished, or ignored, in what you understood was expected of you. And even if you grow up and build your life far from that setting, if you don't do conscious work, you'll keep repeating what you witnessed. Emotional patterns don't vanish simply with distance. They remain inside, camouflaged in decisions you believe you're making freely, but that actually follow scripts you never wrote. There comes a moment when you must pause and look squarely at what you've carried, what you took on without question, what you accepted as part of you but was really someone else's projection. And that hurts, because it forces you to see that many of your insecurities, ways of protecting yourself, methods of loving, or your habit of staying silent did not originate in you. They derive from a legacy that isn't yours, but that you learn to uphold to fit in, to avoid breaking with the status quo, to avoid disappointing those around you. Forgiveness also means examining that inheritance, not to blame those who raised you, not to point fingers, but to understand the motives behind their actions. Most of them, too, did what they could with what they had, and often that was very little. No one taught them to manage pain, to show affection, to apologize, to hold difficult conversations. No one gave them tools. They merely repeated what they saw. And so, from generation to generation, Invisible chains were passed down, chains that now you must break. And it isn't easy, because breaking with what you learned hurts. It hurts to question family loyalty, to admit something wasn't right, to step away from familiar dynamics so as not to keep reproducing them. But it is necessary. If you don't, you end up living someone else's life. You feel guilty for things you didn't do. You react as if you were still inside that home where you couldn't be yourself. Here, forgiveness isn't directed at one person. It is directed at an entire system. It is releasing the burden of what you didn't understand, of what you accepted as normal when it wasn't, of what you absorbed as yours without ever choosing it. That is where a new kind of freedom begins, when you decide you will not keep passing on the same patterns, that you will not repeat harmful words, that you will not stay silent when you're hurt, nor demand from others what you never received. When you dare to do things differently, even without role models, even if no one understands, even if others look at you as if you were the problem. Because you're not. The problem is inertia, and someone must break it. Someone must pay the price for doing things another way. And if you're listening to this, somewhere inside you already know that someone is you. Forgiving emotional inheritance is not accepting that everything was fine. It is recognizing that if you do nothing, you will keep repeating a story that neither begins nor ends with you. And by choosing to act, to heal, to break the cycle, you write a different ending. And that, even if you don't see it yet, is also an act of love toward those who came before. Because by healing, you give them what they may never have granted themselves: understanding, relief, a new way to close their own chapters. And it is also an act of love toward those who come after you. Because if you change how you view, speak, and show up, you offer them a different reference point, a new starting place. You teach them that it is possible to live without repeating what hurts, to build from a different foundation, without dragging a lifetime of the same suffering. But to get there, you must undertake honest work. You must sit with yourself and review what you were given, what was missing, what was too much, what you normalized, what you now understand wasn't right. You must allow yourself to feel anger, sadness, nostalgia. You must name what until now was only discomfort or confusion. And you must decide with resolve which parts you will continue to hold on to and which parts you will release. It is not a quick process. It is not a clean break. Sometimes you find yourself reacting just as you once did, just when you thought you'd moved past it. Sometimes you feel guilt for distancing yourself from what harmed you. Sometimes you feel alone, but you are doing the right thing. You are dismantling a structure that has functioned without question for far too long, and that demands courage, commitment, and patience. Emotional inheritances are not chosen, but you can choose what to do with them. And if you decide you will not keep bearing what isn't yours, then a different stage begins. One more yours, freer, more conscious. Imperfect, yes, but real. Chapter 11. The silent harm. Not all pain makes noise. Not everything that leaves a mark provides a dramatic scene you can recount. Sometimes what hurts most is precisely what didn't happen, what wasn't said, what wasn't held when it was needed. And because there is no clear image to represent it, no obvious conflict to point out, you grow accustomed to thinking maybe you're overreacting, maybe it doesn't count, maybe your pain isn't that serious. But it was. Because silence hurts, indifference scars, constant absence, even without reproach, is a form of abandonment. What remains unnamed and unacknowledged makes its way into your emotional life. You learn to expect less, to settle for the bare minimum, to believe that is normal. If you grew up where emotions were inconvenient, where the important thing was not to bother others, where everyone kept their burdens to themselves, then pain becomes discreet, internal, unseen. But you feel it, even if you can't explain why, even if you don't know its origin or how to name it. Sometimes that harm has no single phrase of origin, no dramatic rupture scene. Instead, it's the accumulation of small absences, avoided glances, words left unsaid. The father always physically present but emotionally absent. The mother who did everything but never learned to hug. The partner who said, "I love you," but never truly listened. The friend who never asked how you really were. So you stayed silent, not wanting to seem demanding, not wanting to make a fuss over something you couldn't even articulate. So you swallowed it and stored it inside. But none of that goes away. It transforms into an undefined sadness, into unexpected insecurity, into an inner voice telling you you don't deserve to be seen. And then you build relationships from that belief. You become cautious, guarded, loving half-heartedly so as not to feel that same cold again. Without realizing it, you begin to perpetuate the very harm you suffered, this time by your own hand, not out of malice, but because you simply don't know any other way. Silent harm is hard to detect because it takes no clear form, no shouts, no charged arguments, no visible evidence. But emotional absence hurts. You felt unseen when you needed to be seen, ignored when you needed to be heard. That pain needs neither dramatic scene nor overt hostility to be real. And because it lacks a clear culprit, you doubt your right to feel it. You think others have endured worse. You remind yourself you have food, shelter, opportunity. But the heart does not work by statistics. It knows what it felt. If you felt abandoned in company, chilled despite being surrounded by people, your pain is valid and needs no justification. Forgiving this kind of harm begins by acknowledging it, by refusing to minimize it, by giving yourself permission to say, "I missed that. It hurt. I didn't deserve that." Even if there is no one to blame, no scene to reconstruct, no ill intent behind it. Because the wound lies in the emotional fallout, how it taught you to shrink, to hide parts of yourself, to mistrust genuine care. And that deserves healing. You cannot change what happened. You cannot force anyone to see what they chose not to see. But you can stop being trapped in that dynamic. You can stop surrounding yourself with people who replicate it. You can build a space where emotions are welcome, where you don't have to hide your feelings, where you demand real presence instead of bits of attention. Forgiving silent harm is a profound act of courage. It requires looking at the invisible, holding the absence in your awareness, naming the void. And it is uncomfortable, because we would rather deny our own needs than face that we lacked them. But only by accepting it can you transform it. Only then can you stop repeating it. Only then can you start treating yourself with the care you never received. It's not about finding culprits. It's about taking responsibility. About deciding that your emotional story will not keep repeating the same script. That you will change the narrative, learn to show up, to listen, to hold, to give yourself what you never had. Not to compensate for the past, but to refuse to mortgage your present. The harm that goes unseen also needs healing, words, forgiveness, not to excuse, but to close, to stop carrying something that, though silent, left its mark. Because the wounds we bury are the ones that take longest to heal. And if you are now becoming aware of this, you have already begun to heal. Chapter 12. Anger is not your enemy. Anger is not the problem. How you avoid feeling it is. How you swallow it until it burns you inside. How you feign calm while everything in you demands you set boundaries. How you smile outwardly while inside you're screaming that enough is enough. Anger does not destroy you. Forced silence does. Constant suppression, fear of appearing aggressive or being judged for losing control. It's not anger that makes you lose control. It's what you do to avoid it. Anger is a defense mechanism, a body's way of signaling that something is wrong, that you're crossing a line, that you're betraying yourself, that someone is hurting you or you are abandoning yourself again. Anger appears to set a limit, to protect, to remind you that your feelings matter, that what you experience has impact, that you are not here to endure everything. Yet you learned to hide it. From childhood, you were taught that anger equals misbehavior, that raising your voice is impolite, that showing frustration indicates emotional weakness. You learned to repress, to control, to mask. Over the years, you equated being proper with not feeling, equated strength with not getting angry, equated harmony with silence. So you swallowed the fire, claimed nothing was wrong, wore the mask of someone who understands, accepts, endures. But your body remembers. Your reactions betray you. Your relationships reflect it. Because unexpressed anger doesn't vanish, it accumulates, morphs into passivity, apathy, sarcasm, silent judgments. It shows up as bodily tension, migraines, chronic sadness of unknown origin. And when it finally erupts, it often hits the wrong target, at the worst time, with disproportionate force. Because it isn't only the present situation that angers you, but everything you've been bottling up. All the times you should have spoken but didn't. All the moments you stayed quiet to avoid trouble, to avoid looking weak, to avoid losing someone. Repressed anger doesn't make you peaceful. It makes you disconnected from yourself, your needs, your emotions. And the issue is not only internal, but also relational. If you can't express anger healthily, you stop setting boundaries. You let others treat you in ways you wouldn't tolerate. You fail to say, "This hurts me," or "I won't accept that." You become a muted version of yourself, obliging, controlled, yet resentful and frustrated. True forgiveness is impossible if you don't make space for anger. Often it is the first emotion that arises when you see clearly the harm done to you, when you realize someone failed you, something hurt more than you thought, someone violated your boundaries. Denying that anger denies the beginning of your own healing process. No one is angry without reason. Anger is legitimate, an inner shout telling you you don't deserve what you endured. Of course, this is not a call to reckless outbursts. It's about allowing anger room to breathe, to be heard, to be understood, to recognize what it seeks to protect, to admit it speaks for a part of you that long went unheard. When you permit yourself to feel anger without fear, judgment, or guilt, something aligns inside you. You stop betraying your true experience. And from that recognition, you can choose how to express it. With words instead of screams, with firm boundaries instead of walls, with authenticity instead of aggression. Anger, when acknowledged and voiced consciously, does not destroy. It orders, frees, protects. If you learn to live with it rather than hide it, it becomes an ally, a compass. Denying it only distances you from your truth and leaves you vulnerable to abuse, exhaustion, emotional drain. Because if you don't know how to be angry, you don't know how to defend yourself. And anyone who can't defend themselves ends up giving more than they should, staying silent when they want to speak, losing themselves in the pursuit of a harmony that doesn't exist. Behind anger often lies pain. Pain you didn't know how to express otherwise, disappointment you swallowed, injustice you accepted. Repressing it serves no purpose, because when anger speaks, it speaks from the depths, from what remains unresolved, from what still hurts, from what you have yet to fully forgive. You need not fear it or mask it. You need to learn to live with it without being consumed, to give it space, without letting it occupy everything. Anger is not dangerous. What is dangerous is ignoring it, not knowing what to do with it, living as if it didn't exist, for then it acts in shadows, impulsively, in resentment. Learning to express anger with emotional maturity is self-care, self-esteem, self-connection, and part of forgiveness, because you cannot let go of what you won't allow yourself to feel. Anger helps you release through the body, through honesty, through truth. And sometimes what prevents you from moving on is not the wound itself. but what you have kept inside by not letting your anger speak its truth. That something was wrong, that someone hurt you deeply, that you deserve better. You are not broken for feeling anger. You are alive. You are responding. You are asserting what you need. What matters is how you channel it, what you build from its strength. Chapter 13. What if they never say sorry? Sometimes the apology you wait for never comes, not because you don't deserve it or it isn't needed, but because the other person doesn't see it, doesn't understand, or refuses to acknowledge their wrongdoing. And that hurts, sometimes even more than the original offense. Because a part of you remains frozen on that unspoken gesture, that word left unsaid, that sincere look that never came. Part of you keeps expecting an apology that never arrives, as if that single word could finally close what still weighs on you. But there are times when it won't happen, because some people live oblivious to the harm they cause, so wrapped in their own narratives that they cannot face the part of themselves responsible for hurting you. And at bottom, this is less malice than fragility, a fear of admitting fault, of losing control, of feeling guilt. That does not erase their wrongdoing. It does not excuse or soften it, but it offers you a clue. The forgiveness you seek may not depend on you. If you stay anchored to that expectation, you poison yourself every day. Each passing moment without an apology confirms you won't get what you need, fueling frustration, anger, injustice. You cannot build your healing on an apology that may never come, nor tie your well-being to someone else's willingness to admit fault. There comes a time when you must decide not to live from the wound anymore. You don't need their admission to validate your pain or confirm your truth. Your story matters even without recognition. Your emotions are legitimate even if they are denied. For as long as you wait, you give your peace to someone who already hurt you, and remain bound to their point of view, trapped in a narrative they refuse to change. Yes, it hurts to realize the apology isn't forthcoming to release the illusion that one day they'll understand. But that too becomes an act of freedom. The moment you choose to free yourself, you stop needing them to repair what they won't. You choose to heal yourself, to close your own chapter. Forgiving without an apology is one of the hardest acts you can undertake. It forces you to carry the emotional weight alone, to close a wound without the one who opened it holding your hand, to process the hurt without external validation. Not everyone is prepared for this, because it is neither soft nor easy. It is mature forgiveness, honest, painful, but the most transformative. Because once you release that expectation, you reclaim something you lost, control over your own story. You are no longer waiting or conditioned by someone else's change, by their awareness, by their remorse. You begin to heal without needing everything to fit neatly, without needing them to see what you have already seen. And only then can you really move forward. This does not mean you no longer care or have forgotten. It means you decide not to carry the weight of that pending apology, choosing to let go not because it didn't matter, but because your self-care matters more. You stop begging for emotional validation that never came and instead close the story yourself, with your own signature of choice. Yes, it is unfair, but it is possible. And when you finally do it, you'll discover the one apology you truly needed was the one you gave yourself by recognizing your worth, validating your own experience, choosing yourself. The rest becomes secondary. Chapter 14. Time doesn't heal, awareness does. It's easy to say time heals all wounds. It sounds comforting, hopeful, a cheap consolation when you don't know what to say to someone who's broken. But it isn't true. Time alone heals nothing. It merely passes, placing distance between what happened and the moment you're in now. It blankets wounds with routine and distractions, days filled with tasks that, for a while, help you avoid looking at the pain. But that isn't healing. It's postponing. People carry the same emotional wound for years, still stuck on the same emotional level. The wound remains open, even if it no longer bleeds. Only it seeps out now and then, in disproportionate reactions, inexplicable fears, enduring distrust. Because time passing is not the same as you traversing it with awareness. Because surviving is not the same as healing. Forgetting is not the same as integrating. Burying is not the same as understanding. Healing requires presence. It demands looking, pausing, deciding to face what still weighs on you. And time does none of that. You do. Unseen pain that is never addressed stays under the surface, shaping anxiety, toxic patterns, repetitive relationship dynamics. You can change scenery, job, partner, even rebuild your external life. Yet if you don't do the internal work, the wound remains, silent, active, waiting for any excuse to break through. No, it's not about remaining anchored in the past or constantly dredging up old hurts. It's about acknowledging what still burdens you, refusing to disguise avoidance as healing. It's daring to say this hurt me without proving it. Because awareness isn't about discovering something new, but admitting what you already felt, but wouldn't allow yourself to admit. What you've been feeling but never named. The healing journey begins when you stop running. When you pause, decide intentionally to look inward. Ask yourself what truly hurt. What part of you remains trapped? What you haven't yet forgiven. It's not easy. Initially it hurts more, because what you buried begins to surface again. But that is a different kind of pain. The pain of cleaning house, not of continued contamination. To heal is not to forget, but to remember without burning, to speak of what happened without chest tightness, to look back without triggering your body. And that doesn't happen by letting time pass while pretending nothing happened. It happens by staying present, feeling it, grieving if need be, understanding it, not to excuse anyone or sweeten the story, but to see how it affected you, how it shaped you, what part of you remained behind. Awareness liberates, not years on the calendar. It is how you decide to be with yourself, how you speak to yourself when memories resurface, the honesty you bring to your own wounds. If you don't do this inner work, no external intervention, no therapy, no book can replace your willingness to face your truth. People say time will make it better, but if you disregard your wounds, you keep acting from them without realizing. And awareness is more than mental understanding. It is bodily recognition, realizing that the rage you once denied still flares, that your sadness remains weighted, that you continue reacting as if you are back in that moment, though years have passed. When you bring awareness, you can choose differently. Notice the wound and refuse to be driven by it. Observe the fear without letting it dictate your steps. Feel the emotion without being overwhelmed. But time alone will not grant you that. You must. There are no quick fixes, no shortcuts. But there is a moment when, if you dare to truly be present with yourself, something shifts. Not because the pain disappears instantly, but because its grip loosens. You realize you can hold it, move through it, not keep fleeing. And then time finally can serve you, because you fill it with awareness, understanding, choice. Yes, healing takes time. But it isn't time that heals. It is what you do in that time. What you choose to look at, to feel, to process, to integrate. That is what gradually makes the pain less painful, the past less controlling, the wound more a part of your story and less a barrier to your future. Chapter 16. The body also speaks. There are things your body remembers even when you no longer want to speak of them. Things that didn't happen yesterday, last month, or even a few years ago, yet they remain lodged in your muscles, in your breathing, in the way you walk, in how you sit, in the rhythm of your life. And no matter how many times you say you've moved on, if you haven't digested it inside, your body won't believe you. Because the body does not lie. It doesn't rationalize. It doesn't deceive itself. It simply acts. It simply reacts. It simply expresses what you have not yet allowed yourself to fully feel. That constant tension in your shoulders, that clenched jaw, that insomnia no routine can calm. Those recurring aches, that pressure in your chest, that sense of fatigue that won't lift no matter how much rest you get. It isn't always physical. Sometimes it's memory, emotional memory. Memory you haven't processed with words, yet the body continues holding it because you haven't given it any other outlet. And this is no coincidence. When you cannot express yourself, your body does it for you. When you refuse to cry, something shrinks inside. When you don't say what you need to say, your breath becomes shorter, tenser. When you pretend everything is fine, your body goes on alert. You might not even notice. You might normalize it. You might even think you've always had stomach problems, or that bad sleep is just part of your nature. But if you observe honestly, you'll see that many times the body is not broken. It's overloaded. It's trying to help you. It's signaling you. It's speaking in the only language it has left when you decide to look the other way. Because you can keep yourself silent inside for a long time. But the body will always find a way to warn you. Sometimes through mild symptoms, sometimes with blockages, sometimes with illnesses that finally force you to stop. And when that happens, it's not just about seeking a medical solution, which of course is necessary, but also looking at what lies behind it. What you're enduring, what you aren't naming, what you keep dragging along against your will. Your body also needs forgiveness. It also needs emotional rest. It also needs you to stop living in survival mode. Because if you don't, it tenses. It adapts. But at a high cost. Because it wasn't made to sustain constant sadness, repressed anger, or chronic fear. And yet it does. Because it adapts to you. Because it follows you. Because it protects you. Until it can't anymore. And I'm not speaking of magic. I'm speaking of something as basic as watching yourself with attention. How you breathe around certain people. How your stomach knots when something overwhelms you. How your hands tense when you force yourself to remain silent. How your heart races when you mentally relive that scene you thought was closed. The body says it all. But to hear it, you must stop. You must turn down the external noise. You must stop being so busy all the time that you can't feel. And when you finally stop, when you give yourself space to listen to your body, to see how you really are, many things fall into place on their own. Not because they disappear, but because, for the first time, you acknowledge them. And that is where change begins. In realizing you cannot treat your body like a machine. You cannot keep demanding more than you yourself can emotionally sustain. You cannot keep asking it to endure without first asking yourself what you're forcing it to swallow. And this, too, has to do with forgiveness. Because many times, before you can forgive someone else, you need to release all that your body has been accumulating for that connection. Everything you kept silent, everything you avoided feeling, everything you had to hold up so you wouldn't break. Because it's not enough to say, I forgive. If your body remains on alert, if your breathing remains the same every time you think of it, if your jaw clenches when you speak of that person, then you haven't let go of anything. Forgiveness also runs through the body, not only the mind. It is not solely a mental decision. It is an emotional release you notice physically. When you truly let go, you feel it in how you sleep, how you breathe, how you walk. When you allow yourself to cry what you didn't cry then, your body loosens. When you listen to yourself with honesty and presence, your body no longer has to scream to get your attention. And yes, of course you can do therapy. Of course you can work on your beliefs, your story, your bonds. But do not forget that while all that happens, your body participates too. It is involved. It is holding. It is accumulating. It is waiting for you to restore its right to feel unfiltered, unmasked, unrushed. And if you don't, it will continue speaking, in tension, in symptoms, in blockages. Listening to the body is not a matter of spirituality. It is a matter of respect, of presence, of not living disconnected. Because when you learn to read what your body tells you, you realize how many things you were ignoring, how many boundaries you crossed, how many times you betrayed yourself just to avoid inconvenience. And you also realize how many of your decisions you make not from calm, but from urgency, from defense, from an activation you don't even fully understand. That is why forgiveness isn't just a mental act. It is also bodily. It involves sending your body the message that it no longer has to keep fighting, that it no longer has to protect you as if you were still in danger, that now you can stop, that now you can support what you once could not, and that, even if it doesn't seem so, is also a form of healing. Chapter 17. Rewriting your story. Your story does not change. What happened, happened. What broke, broke. What didn't take place, will not. But that does not mean you cannot look at it differently, that you cannot return to that past with a new perspective, that you cannot reconstruct what you made of what you lived. Because one thing is what occurred, and another quite different thing is how you've chosen to narrate it to yourself these many years. And sometimes that internal narration has hurt you more than the events themselves. Think about it. No pain is worsened more than when you repeat it over and over from guilt, from judgment, from a sense of never having been enough. It isn't just the memory that weighs you down. It is the interpretation you have given to it. It is the place you've positioned yourself within your own story. It is that inner voice that reminds you every day that you messed up, that you should have done things differently, that you tolerated too much, that you were too late, that you trusted the wrong person. But that voice is not absolute truth. It is just one version, just one reading, and you can change it. This is not about sugarcoating what you lived, nor about glossing over it, nor about pretending it didn't hurt. It is about narrating it from a fairer, more adult place, from the you of today, not the wounded you who reacted as best you could in that moment. Because we have all done things that today we understand in another light. We have all stayed silent when we should have spoken up, allowed what we didn't want, held on to connections that no longer made sense. And that does not make you weak. It makes you human. Rewriting your story does not mean altering the facts. It means shifting the frame, the internal context from which you understand them. It means acknowledging that, though you did not choose what happened, you can choose how to remember it, what place to give it in your present, and what to do with what once broke you. And that decision changes everything. Because you cannot build something new if you continue defining yourself by what you lost. If you keep telling yourself that you are the person who was harmed, who didn't set boundaries, who stayed in places that hurt you, you already know it. You've already understood it. Now it's time to move on. Identity transforms too, and sometimes without realizing it, you have made your wound your identity. You use your story of pain to explain everything. Why you react the way you do, why you distrust, why you don't allow yourself to feel. And yes, there is pain behind it, but there is also a choice. A way of continuing to tell yourself that perpetuates suffering, prolongs it, makes it structural. And therein lies the challenge. Recognizing you can stop telling yourself that way, that you can make room for a new voice, one of compassion, one that acknowledges your pain without turning it into drama, one that sees what you did well, however small, one that does not reduce you to the worst you have experienced. That voice is also within you. You simply haven't let it speak enough. because for years you've turned up the volume on criticism, reproach, and judgment, and you feel it. In how you relate, in what you believe you deserve, in what you tolerate, in what you avoid. Because if you do not change your internal story, everything you build will stay limited by that script, not because it is true, but because you sustain it as though it were. Forgiveness, the true kind, begins here, by ceasing to narrate yourself from the wound and starting to narrate from awareness, from what you have learned, from what you now choose to be. That is what liberates you. Not erasing the past, but changing how you inhabit it. Because you cannot erase what happened, but you can relocate it. Make it no longer hurt as it used to. Transform it into something that, though it never should have occurred, now propels you, makes you more lucid, more grounded, more aware. And that shift, though unnoticed by others, changes everything. Chapter 18. Who benefits from your resentment? Some emotions you feel so strongly that they seem woven into your very identity. Resentment is one of them. It settles in, makes itself at home, blends into your memories, your gestures, your reactions, your silences, and your words. Over time, if you aren't clear about it, you begin to confuse resentment with character, with dignity, even with justice. But the truth is, resentment is not a firm stance. It is a prison. And the most perverse thing is that you may not even own it. You drag it around, you feed it, but you didn't consciously choose it. Because the uncomfortable question isn't, why am I resentful? But, who does it serve that I remain so? It isn't always obvious. There is no single person gleefully watching you suffer. Yet there is an emotional structure, a dynamic, a way of being in the world that is reinforced every time you keep resentment alive. And this has consequences. Someone benefits from your refusal to let go, from your unwillingness to forgive, from your refusal to move on. And often that someone can even be yourself. Not because you enjoy suffering, but because resentment offers you something. A solid identity, a clear enemy, the perfect excuse for avoiding deeper introspection. When you are resentful, everything else falls neatly into place. You know who to blame. You know what to protect yourself from. You know why you react the way you do. Resentment supplies you reasons, direction, companionship, but it also costs you spontaneous joy, connection with the present, freedom. It turns you into a more rigid, more limited, more predictable version of yourself. And here enters the most delicate point: the comfort of resentment. There is something perversely comfortable about holding on to it. It doesn't demand as much as forgiveness. It doesn't ask you to question yourself. It doesn't force you to let go. It gives you a clear vantage point, but a stagnant one. And when someone lives from that place too long, they begin to defend resentment as though it were part of their integrity, as though letting it go meant surrender, as though forgiveness meant allowing oneself to be stepped on. But that is not true. That is confusion. A confusion that keeps you right where you were when the pain first took hold. So who benefits? Those who do not want you to grow. Those who fear what you might become if you stopped looking back. That part of you that prefers anger to emptiness. That prefers having something fixed, even if painful, over living with the uncertainty of rebuilding. Because forgiveness does not guarantee immediate peace, does not excuse the past, but opens a new space, a space with no script, one that compels you to move. And that initially is frightening, because it means you can choose. You can live without that burden. You can no longer be defined by what happened, but by what you do now with it. That is a threat to everything that fed on your resentment. The excuses you've repeated for years. The relationships built around that wound. Your own internal narrative, which may no longer make sense without that pain-filled chapter. Letting go of resentment also means letting go of that narrative, and rewriting it hurts. It means relinquishing certainties, choosing without past anchors, being someone new without betraying yourself. But you are the one who must make that choice. And that is the act of courage that frees you. And it's not about blaming external culprits or making lists of who gains from your resentment. It's about seeing how trapped you remain, realizing the price you pay for nurturing an emotion you know is consuming you, acknowledging you can let go without denying your story, without minimizing what you lived, without whitewashing anything. You can release it because you choose to, because you've carried enough, because you now deserve to live from another energy. Resentment not only shapes your memories, it filters your current perspective. You begin to see enemies where there are none, to overreact, to distrust by default, to protect yourself even when there's no attack. And all that wears you down, it distances you from the life you want, turning you into someone who responds more to the past than to the present. And the hardest part is you may not even notice. You believe you simply are this way, that life made you like this. But it isn't life. It's the resentment that shaped you, and you can stop holding it. The question isn't whether you're right. It's whether you want to stay this way. Whether holding resentment offers you anything worthwhile. Whether the energy you spend keeping it alive might not be better invested in something constructive. Because in the end, to resent is to give power to what hurt you, to keep it alive in your life, to act as if it were still happening. And that is not justice. That is where. Releasing resentment is an act of power, an internal affirmation, a clean break, a conscious decision you make not to benefit anyone else, but to reclaim your space, your energy, your emotional dignity. And though it may unsettle, hurt, and stir many things, that is what allows you to truly begin again. Chapter 19. Forgiveness as a daily practice. Forgiveness is not an event. It is not a single conversation or isolated decision you make one day, and that's it. It is not some emotional ceremony where you close your eyes, inhale deeply, say, "I forgive," and everything disappears. If only it were so simple. But it isn't. Forgiveness is constant work. It is a practice, a way of seeing, a choice you must renew many times, even when you thought you had overcome it. Because the memory returns, in a brushed-over conversation, a word that recalls it, a new situation that reconnects you to what you thought was past. And in that moment is where forgiving becomes a fresh decision. That is when you realize it is not enough to have said it. It is not enough to have thought it. You must choose again and again, not to get stuck in the same loop. Forgiveness as a daily act is about refusing to let the past continue to wield power over you. And that is not achieved once. It is trained. It is practiced. Some days you see with clarity, calm, and perspective. And other days you flare up, dredge it all up, feel you cannot. And that's okay. It isn't inconsistency. It is process. It is human. The problem isn't that the pain returns. It's how you choose to treat it when it does. And that is where forgiveness becomes emotional discipline. You must understand forgiveness doesn't always feel like an immediate release. Sometimes it is silent, subtle. You simply choose not to react the same, not to close doors, not to feed the criticism, not to fall into the same spiral. And that too is forgiveness. Because you are choosing yourself over that story, proving daily you no longer wish to operate from the wound. And of course, it isn't easy, because sometimes the wound remains open. Sometimes the pain hasn't wholly faded. But forgiveness doesn't mean it no longer hurts. It means you choose not to be carried away by that hurt. You choose to hold it consciously, to act from a clearer place. And that requires presence, maturity, willingness to let go, even when a part of you still wants to stay angry, punish, or simply shut down. Because the ego will tell you not to forgive, that it is a sign of weakness, that if the other didn't ask, you don't have to, that forgiving means losing. But that is noise, pride misunderstood. Forgiveness is not losing. It is no longer losing. It is refusing to expend your energy on what does not lead you anywhere new. It is letting go of a burden no one else carries but you, and that is a form of self-love. Here, the everyday matters. Not only the great forgiveness that sets you free, but the times you choose not to nurture resentment, the times you decide to speak instead of remain silent in anger, the times you choose to listen even when you don't want to hear, times you choose understanding, not to justify, but to avoid continued self-harm through constricting interpretations. Forgiveness is choosing peace amid noise, and that is not done once but every day, including with yourself, because one of the hardest resentments is the one you hold against yourself for what you did or didn't do. And there, too, you must forgive daily. Every time you criticize yourself, demand too much, compare yourself to those who don't share your history or your wounds. Every time you strive for perfection, for immunity, to be someone else. Self-forgiveness is equally necessary and also takes practice. No one forgives completely on the first try. We all relapse, revisit scenes, repeat mental scripts, fall into judgments we thought were behind us. And it is here you see if you truly commit to forgiveness, not in how you express it outwardly, but in how you maintain it within. In how you manage feelings without allowing them to decide for you. In how you act from the version of yourself that no longer needs to remain at war. Daily forgiveness also involves setting boundaries. It is not passivity. It is not swallowing everything. It is making choices with clarity, deciding whom you let in, with whom you speak, what you allow and what you do not, but doing so without hatred, without intent to hurt, without clinging to a story you aim to close. Forgiveness is taking distance with self-respect, with awareness, with regard for what you lived, but above all, with responsibility for what you now want to live. And not everyone will understand. Some will say you gave up, that you're being soft, that you should stay angrier. But they do not carry your burden. They do not sleep with your tension. They do not know how much it costs to carry that emotion every day. That is why forgiveness is yours. It is intimate, personal, needing no outside approval, just coherence, commitment to yourself, honesty to recognize living the same way again leads nowhere new. It is far easier to cling to resentment, to reproach, to wait for a repair that never comes. But that immobilizes you, blocks you, dries you out. If you are here, if you've made it this far, it is because you no longer wish to operate from that place. Because you know, even if you sometimes forget, that you have the right to live without that weight, that you can choose forgiveness not because others deserve it, but because you need it. And that choice, though it may seem small, changes everything. Chapter 20. Your identity beyond the wound. Who are you without that wound? Not what you show outwardly, not how you respond when asked, not the story you've repeated for years to explain why you are the way you are. I mean the version of you that would exist if you no longer had to protect yourself, if you did not define yourself by what hurt you, if you did not live with that part of your past as your banner. That version that doesn't require justification or anticipation, that isn't driven by reaction, that wasn't built around defense. Do you know it? Do you recognize it? It is difficult, I know, because when something cuts deep, it leaves more than a scar. It becomes a frame of reference. Over time, you adapt to that version. You identify with your pain. You give it a name, a narrative, a role. And without realizing it, you start operating from there. From what was done to you, from what you lost, from what you didn't receive, from what you had to endure. And all your personality bends to avoid that feeling ever again. How you speak, how you love, how you distrust, how you say yes, what you avoid. Everything revolves around not reliving what once hurt. But living that way comes at a price. Even though that persona protects you, it also limits you. It prevents you from discovering who you could be if you no longer needed to stay on guard. If you cast off guilt, fear, rage, the constant need to be right or to appear above others, who would you be then? This is not about denying your story or minimizing your experience. You are here for a reason. You endured what you endured, and that left its mark. But it need not dictate your future. Forgiveness, personal work, everything you've done thus far does not only serve to ease the pain, it serves to open a larger space. An identity not built from your wound, but from your awareness. And owning that identity is harder to embrace because it has fewer certainties. It has no obvious enemies. It isn't predicated on what you already know, but on what you are willing to explore. Living without that wound at your center means accepting you have the power to choose, that you no longer need to justify every reaction by your past, that you can change without betraying yourself, that you can be different without forgetting anything. But for that, you must stop treating your story as a refuge, because pain, however painful, can be comfortable. It gives you identity, a narrative, justification. When you release it, when you decide to live from another place, you feel vertigo. You lack structure. You wonder if it's real, if you're deceiving yourself, if you'll miss something. But no, you're letting go of the script, no longer acting like you're stuck on the same scene. And for the first time, you start to live without a script. There is nothing more liberating than discovering you can be yourself without always defending, without needing a story behind you to explain your limits, your choices, your presence. You can make peace with your past without staying trapped in it, because true forgiveness isn't for others or even for yourself. It is for life. It is deciding you no longer want to live from tension, from repetition, from the roles of victim or avenger. It is accepting you deserve well-being, not because you've suffered, but because you are alive and can allow yourself to. And that is when everything shifts. You move more lightly, no longer burdened by the need to prove anything, no longer needing to be right, no longer requiring someone else's recognition or perfect alignment. You simply realize it isn't about closing a circle, but about stepping off it. Your identity is not the sum of your traumas. It is not the unhealed wound. It is not what you lacked. It is what you choose to build from here, what you choose to uphold, what you decide to leave behind. It is how you treat yourself when you are low, how you speak to yourself, how you care for yourself, how you choose to relate to others, and that shows, without explanation. When someone begins to live without their wound as the center, everything in their presence changes. Their tone, their gaze, their presence. It isn't superiority, it is something else. It is having gone through everything and yet refusing to let it define you. It is knowing you might react from anger but choosing otherwise. You could close off, but you allow yourself to open. You could remain bitter, but you don't need to. Because you are no longer trapped, you no longer live to defend yourself. You can simply be you, without the story behind you, without the character in front, without walls in between. That is freedom. Not perfect, not final, but real. And that freedom is yours. Not because it was given to you, not because everything is resolved, but because you are claiming it. Because you are ready to live from another place. Thank you for accompanying me to the end of this journey. If any part of this audiobook resonated with you, moved you, prompted you to reconsider something, or simply made you feel less alone in what you carry, I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters too. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss upcoming content. Together we continue building a space for those who want to grow without filters, with truth and with courage. I'll see you soon.